Hi, this is lecture 8. We're going to talk about the commodification of sex and bodies. And we've got three main themes I want to talk about via the readings you've done for this unit. And those are the relationship between commodities and sexuality, the nature of transactional sexual relationships, and commodified body parts. So let's go ahead and look at those three themes. Okay. And I think this particular theme, commodities and sexuality, also connects well with the projects you're doing on commodity chains, because this is the example that is most about an object that is bought and sold and the ways that that object informs gender, sexuality, and a bunch of other things, okay? So this is, of course, the Curtis article, and what Curtis is talking about is sex toy consumption and its role in what she refers to as sexual subjectivities. So, as you read, what the ethnographic example is for this is these sort of on the model of Tupperware parties, right, where somebody who is a representative for this sex toy company, which is called Athena, goes to somebody's house where they sort of bring together a bunch of their friends, and they have this sort of social gathering that is also an opportunity to learn about these products and then ultimately purchase them. So what Curtis is really looking at is the relationship between market forces, right? Buying, selling, production, consumption, and sexuality. And this is in the context, of course, of a capitalist system. And as she notes, capitalist identity, or one's identity in the context of a capitalist system, means that who we are often depends in a significant way on the objects we interact with, including especially the products that we buy, right? If you think about life in the United States, it's a very good example of that, right? That consumption is sort of central to putting forward who one is in the world. So one of the questions then posed by this example is a question of cause and effect. So in other words, does the market, meaning in this case, the sort of proliferation of commodities or products that you can buy, does that create or does that reflect sexualities, and particularly, the expanding range of people's sexuality, sexual identities, and what she refers to as sexual innovation, right? So in other words, does the fact that a company like Athena's offers a wide range of different kinds of sex toys, does that inform who people are sexually? Or is it the opposite, that the expanding range of what she calls sexual scripts means that there's more demand for products from a place like Athena, okay? So what this gets into then, which is actually a theme that runs throughout the readings in this unit, and we'll return to it a bit in when we talk about one of the other readings, is the difference between subjectivity and identity. So this is sort of a theory question, but one that's very important. So the idea with subjectivity is that it's about basically your experience from the position that you reside in by virtue of the sociocultural world that you're a part of, right? So identity is typically understood as sort of an assemblage of expectations that are projected onto sort of a category of human, right? So in other words, identity is sort of the public external category for sort of quote unquote who you are. And subjectivity is how you experience your own life via that category, okay? So it's about really inner experience in a lot of ways, which corresponds in all kinds of ways with the identity that you either adopt or is thrust upon you. But it includes some other things, right? So negotiating your own, for example, sensations, desires, interests, etc., with that identity category of which you were understood to be a part. So what Curtis is looking at then in this particular context is the ways that commodities in general, and these particular commodities that are being offered at these parties, shape people's desires and or their sexual scripts. She uses this phrase, sexual scripts, to talk about sort of what people understand to be the sort of story of who they are sexually, right? And that, again, is often in keeping with ideas about gender, status, age, etc., right? So how then does exposure to this perhaps larger range of sex toys than people at these parties have seen before inform how they imagine who they are as sexual people, right? So, of course, the fundamental premise for this entire conversation is that, sexuality is not some innate biological urge, right? It's a socially produced set of tendencies or interests or desires or practices, right? So this is following up very much on readings we did at the very beginning of the semester, particularly, for example, Foucault, right? If you remember what Foucault said about basically the history of sexuality, that sexuality doesn't just sort of emerge from your innate inner desires, that it's fashioned, it's produced over time through all kinds of cultural, historical phenomena and events. So likewise here, right? So she's sort of trying to map out one moment in the history of sexuality, if you will, which is the market in sex toys and how it may have or may in the future inform those sexual scripts and maybe ultimately even those sort of categories of identity. So again, the ethnographic example is these sex toy parties where women bring together friends, family members, etc., and they see a sort of presentation from the rep for this company who talks about these products. And a lot of what is important about what goes on in these parties is the language that's used. As Curtis notes, the representative uses the language of intimacy, right? So talking about how these toys fit into relationships, right? So they're not understood as just about sex or just about sexual pleasure, but they're about lots of other things like relationships with partners. The other really important thing that happens in these parties, according to Curtis, is that it makes sexuality a social phenomenon, not just a private phenomenon, right? So there's a social context for people thinking about and talking about their sexualities, which is not perhaps always present otherwise. So that said, as Curtis notes, it's not like the narrative coming from this representative or that's, emerging from these parties is super straightforward, right? Like there's some conflicting or some sort of parts that are in tension. So one of those, for example, is that there's sort of a dual message about these sex toys or using these sex toys. Part of it is, health, sexual well-being, fun, right? Like the sort of quote-unquote positive side of that coin. And then the other side is more often projected sort of ideas about sexuality, such as that it's dirty, it shows a lack of control, that there's something problematic or untoward or embarrassing, right, or secret about sex. So both of those things are present. Both of those things are present in both the things that this representative says and in how the women at these parties are processing these issues, all right? So again, it's not that it's a cut and dried process by which people are presented with these objects for sale, but it is something that raises questions about the relationship between what we consume and who we think we are as sexual beings, right? So in other words, where she lands is that the scripts or the sort of stories that are generated by these products create new forms of sexuality or new scripts that women adopt or can adopt. And part of what's going on here is that it allows for this sexual innovation in what is understood as a morally acceptable context, the context of that party with known people where it is sort of safe and acceptable to present your sexual desires and even expand them. Okay, so let's move on to the second theme, which I'm calling transactional sexual relationships, taking it from one of the authors you read, right? So, in other words, not necessarily framing this as sex work or prostitution. And I think what's really interesting about the 3 articles you read that touch on this issue is precisely that it's not all that clear what the commodification, quote unquote, of sex really means, right? Or what the relationship between sex and money, right, really means, because it is so varied. There's a real continuum between non-monetized sex and completely monetized sex. There's a big gray area in the middle. And the way that set of relationships is understood is also really culturally variable, right? So transactional sexual relationships, I think, is a little bit more neutral, and it allows for us to debate, whether something is best categorized as sex work or best categorized as a relationship that happens to have money have a role in it, right? So the Liechty article actually touches on two things, right? It is about monetized sex, but it's also about food. So it's kind of an interesting linchpin between the first theme and the second theme, right? So the food being another kind of commodity or product that people purchase that has a real role in what Liechty is saying is happening in terms of social change in Kathmandu, Nepal. So Liechty's looking at shifts both in the monetization of sex and the sort of the role of public food or public eating, meaning food prepared and consumed in restaurants, and how they're related to the creation of a middle class in Kathmandu, right? A Nepali middle class. And it has a lot to do also with gender. So it's really about the creation of a middle class that focuses on men's behavior, again, in a public sphere. So to start with, Liechty notes that both food and sex in general, not just in this case, are really, in general, potent symbols wherever we find them, right, in any cultural context. And they're often used to naturalize social categories, right? In part because they link the individual and the social body, right? So food is often understood as an important part of cultural tradition, an important part of family life, etc., right? And likewise, sexuality is often central to understandings of personhood, partnership, marriage, lineage, society, etc., right? So it's maybe not surprising then that these two really important symbolic elements of social life are also central to the social change that Liechty is seeing in Kathmandu. So in Nepal, where he is doing this ethnographic study, what he's noting is the shift from a caste system to a class system, right? So in other words, the way that people are organized into social hierarchies is changing, right, or has changed. So a caste system is often understood as more rigid, right? And the characteristics that separate different caste categories are not per se wealth, but often have to do with questions of purity and the family or lineage that you're born into. Class is more so about wealth, and although it in many places is not very movable, is understood as something that an individual can potentially transcend. So this shift from caste to class is connected to these two areas, food and sex, particularly the ways that food and sex have moved from the private sphere to the public sphere. Okay, so let's look at both of those items in turn. So in terms of sex, this is really about prostitution or sex work, and Liechty calls it sex work, right? He doesn't go into the details about exactly what those relationships look like in the way that the other authors do. But what he's really talking about here is that the rise of monetized sex, of sex work, is connected to middle-class men, right? The rise of a social sphere for middle-class Nepali men. And part of that is the role of spaces for capitalist marketplace, right? So there's this sort of free market public sphere, which is both about how men attain middle class status, and it's where things like prostitution are located, right? So in other words, these commercial zones, right, literally like parts of cities, allow for individuals to shift from a class category into or from a caste category into a class category, right? So in other words, there's a sort of a free market of circulating commodities. And one of those commodities is bodies, right? Or at least monetized sex acts. So this is not, again, an easy transition, and there's all kinds of gendered implications. So if men are finding themselves in these commercial public spheres and engaging in things like monetized sex, it also causes a lot of anxiety about the role of women, and particularly feminine gendered roles in society and in families. So women are not becoming a part of that public sphere. They remain in a sort of domestic sphere and are understood to be consumers, not producers, right? So there's a distinction then between women who perform sex work and are part of that sort of public sphere, and women who are acting as wives and sisters and parts of family systems and are part of a domestic sphere. So the shift then takes sex out of the domestic sphere and puts it into the public sphere, where it's understood in different ways than it used to be. So now it's a sort of transaction, right? It's about a seller and a buyer, unlike the understandings of caste distinctions, which are really about pure and impure, right? So again, all of those questions are also projected onto women and whether women are understood as pure or impure, depending on where they're located in this field, right? So food is the other one, right? So sex is part of it, but food is also really important, particularly restaurant food, right? These men, middle-class men eating in public, eating at restaurants, because that really transgresses ideas about food and food consumption according to the caste system, where it's very important to receive food from someone in your caste, right? Not across caste lines. And it's something that, even Liechty points out, is more closely policed than sex, right? So it's a very important sort of part of people's understanding of hierarchies. Despite that, because of market forces, the number of restaurants has increased, partly in response to things like tourists, but it's also, again, been a component of this rise of the middle class, of Nepali middle class people. So only men are going to these restaurants, and that act of public eating, again, is something that's transforming hierarchies. Women, in fact, are discouraging the men from doing it. Part of their role, and frankly their power, is preparing and serving food in the home. So when men go outside of that system and dine in restaurants in public, they are both challenging expectations around gendered family roles and shifting the entire sort of society towards a class-based system as opposed to a caste-based system, right? So men, eating meat and drinking alcohol in public, and men in those same commercial spaces engaging with sex workers are the two elements that are not only about issues of sex and eating, but also about class and change in modern Nepali society. Okay, so the two other articles that we read, that have to do with transactional sexual relationships are both ethnographic pieces set in Southeast Asia, one in Cambodia and one in Thailand. And I think they're really interesting together because the article about Cambodia really focuses on the women engaged in these transactional relationships, and the article focused on Thailand really focuses on the men. So between the two of them, they give us sort of two perspectives on these kinds of transactional sexual relationships. That phrase is especially relevant for these cases because, as you read, this is not something that is easily categorized as sex work. These are relationships that often transcend just sort of one meeting, right, or one day, often turn into long-term relationships, but still tend to have a sort of monetized component. So it really asks us to reconsider the category of sex work or the category of prostitution, and to reconsider, a lot of the feminist theorizing and writing about prostitution, right? Van Boven and Verver are working on women who work in these hostess bars located in tourist areas in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, right? So these bars are not places that are actually selling sexual services, but they're spaces where foreign men, tourist men, and local women meet and in some cases establish relationships that have a sexual component and have a monetary component, right? So again, the authors are encouraging us to get beyond, first, the assumed category of sex work or prostitution, as if that's one thing or the same thing everywhere, and also to get beyond the binary of sex work either being about oppression or being about empowerment, right? That it can be about both of those things, or it can really kind of be about neither. It looks a lot more like the ways that people negotiate or navigate other kinds of relationships. So in talking about the women who are working in these hostess bars, the authors identify two key areas that are points of tension that the women really need to work on, or they need to sort of maneuver around those 2 points of tension. So the first is between the identity or category of a girlfriend and the identity or category of a sex worker. So that's one of these sort of dichotomies or binaries. And the other is between vice and virtue. All right, so let's talk about each of these in turn. So as you read, the relationships that Cambodian women forge with foreign European men are not just about sex. They are often very centrally about making a social, emotional connection, right? Sex is part of it, but there's a lot of time spent sort of getting to know each other and engaging in activities that are more like girlfriend-boyfriend. And indeed, that language of girlfriend-boyfriend gets used in the context of those relationships, right? As part of that idea that it's a little bit more ambiguous than just being something we would easily call sex work, the monetary transaction is also done in a sort of indirect way, right? Women don't demand or ask for a payment up front. There's not a sort of price tag. Often that transfer of money is claimed to be or understood to be a gift, right? So there is an understanding that there's something transactional going on here, but it's couched in terms that are much more about a romantic relationship than about a purely sexual relationship. Likewise, this gray area between vice and virtue is complex for these young women. As you learned, there are strict moral codes for Cambodian women about, particularly around sexuality, being a good girl, being a virgin before marriage. So these young women are clearly taking risks by transgressing those expectations. On the other side, there's also status that comes along with this role because they learn English, because they have access to more money, and because they often are using that money to support their families, right? These are women, young women who come from rural areas, often with families who are agrarian, have farms, and they come to the city to make money that then can help support their family, right? So there is also value to what they're doing for lots of people. There's both stigma and status connected to it, right? So what the authors are really putting forward here is that these kinds of relationships really challenge that boundary, both between intimacy and work and between relationships, romantic relationships, and sex work, right? So it is not easily characterized as either a purely romantic relationship or as prostitution or sex work. It's interesting to put that in a broader context too, right? The notion that romance and sex versus money are separated anywhere, right, is something we might think about, right? Marriages in the United States are romantic and sexual unions that always involve money, right? Not perhaps being paid for a particular sexual act, but the idea that household finances, right, are central to that relationship is absolutely the case, right? So I think this is really just asking us to think more broadly about how certain kinds of social or sexual interactions intersect with money. All right. So the other article that I consider like the bookend or the other half of the pear for the first one about Phnom Penh is this article by Thompson et al., which is also set in Southeast Asia, but in Thailand, and that focuses on the men, which is super interesting because, as the authors point out, we're more likely to hear in any discussion about sex work, we're much more likely to hear about the women, right, or the sex worker, than about the person who is buying those services, who tends to be men, but not always, right? So we get sort of the other side of that story, and this article helps us understand how those men perceive what's going on. And this is particularly around relationships where it's not just a relationship that takes place in the city for a brief moment, but those cases where those relationships lead to marriages where the foreign male partner moves with his Thai wife to her home region to establish an ongoing sort of permanent relationship, right? To locate that relationship in her home lineage and family. So again, we're talking about a few different locations in Thailand and a few different stages of a relationship, right? So where this sort of relationship starts is in Bangkok or some of the sort of beach resorts of Thailand, like Pattaya, where particularly older European men come in contact, again, through typically bars, not unlike the bars that were described in the last article, with women who are, again, willing, interested to be involved in these transactional relationships that involve both sex and money, but often also enduring emotional bonds, right? What Thompson et al. Are really interested in is what the subjectivity of the men is as they transition from being a sex tourist to being a husband who is integrated into a Thai family, right? Again, we have that theoretical question of the difference between identity and subjectivity. And Thompson et al. Really linger on that. They're really interested in making that distinction. And they suggest that anthropologists have not always been super clear on that. But they talk about the fact that identity is really a public category, a public assemblage, whereas subjectivity is about inner experience, right? So in other words, the identity of sex tourist, right, is an ongoing existing sort of category of masculine identity. But when you talk about what an individual man who was or is a sex tourist, how he experiences that identity, particularly as that identity changes from sex tourist to farang, which is his role as now a husband and son-in-law, right? That sort of subjective journey, if you will, does not correspond exactly to the public identity of sex tourists, right? So they're really trying to understand, how do the men who make that transition between these two sort of identities or roles, how do they experience that? What do they think is going on? Who do they think they are as they, again, make this transition? So they talk about both of these roles or identities as emerging masculinities, right? So meaning they are flexible. They're certainly tied to gender and particularly masculinity, but they are established enough that they're recognizable, right, as a category of person, a gendered category of person. So the category of sex tourist, which, again, is not a new category, has been around for a long time, and as they say, has been generated by all kinds of social forces in the world. Certainly the political economy of a post-colonial world, right, has generated or contributed to the rise of the male sex tourist, particularly in the global south, right, and particularly in places like Southeast Asia. There are also social forces within a country like Thailand, right, the relationship between urban and rural areas, right? Changes in expectations of women, etc. And then as importantly is the individual life trajectory, right? As a particular man who starts as a sex tourist, shifts to being, an accepted part or mostly accepted part of a Thai community. So before we get into the details of talking about how men experience that shift from being sex tourists to being husbands and sons-in-law, I just wanted to sort of give you a visual on the geography of these relationships because I think it helps understand what's going on. So over here we have a map of Thailand, and the urban or sort of tourist spaces where these relationships are established are Bangkok, big capital city, which is right there. And then the other region they talk about is Pattaya. So these are sort of is a beach resort area. The area that they then return to, right, the area that the women are originally from and that the men accompany them back to join part of their matrilineal household, is Isan, which is up here, right? So you see then this sort of back and forth between these sort of more urban or tourist areas and this more rural area of homesteads, right, and families. So that is the women originally come from Isan to Bangkok and Pattaya to do this kind of transactional work. And then when they forge relationships with European men in those spaces, then they ultimately go back to Isan to set up their households. Okay. So the Farang in question are, as you read, typically older European men. So they're often quite a bit older than the women who become their wives. Again, most of them are from Europe, some from the US and other parts of the world. And although there's all kinds of contradictions and tensions in these Farang relationships when they do go back to Isan, they are generally considered desirable husbands, right? Not in a small part, because they support the families of the wife, of the woman, right? So absolutely, money and the difference in access to money that reflects global north-south inequities, right, is a part of this story, right? There's no doubt. When these Farang, right, these European foreigner husbands go back to Isan, they are joining the matrilineal and matrilocal household of their wife. And I hope when you read that word matrilineal, it sort of rang a bell and you thought of the Blackwood article that we read several units back, right? Where she talked about matrilineal households, right? And how they're organized, right? And the fact that a matrilineal household is one where ownership and inheritance run through the female line, right? From mother to daughter, so that daughters remain connected to their mother's household. Sons marry out, right? So these European husbands now are becoming sons-in-law to these matrilineages, right? Which typically would involve all kinds of sort of labor that they owe to the household and a particular social role. They are sort of fitting into these matrilineages in some unusual ways, right? To some extent, the Farang husbands are reconfiguring the way the matrilineage works. For example, as we again talked about in the Blackwood article, the architecture attached to these matrilineages is really important. Typically, there's sort of a central woman-owned sort of headquarters, if you will, for the matrilineage, right? In this case, the Farang husband and wife, his wife, are now typically building new houses, right? A little bit away from the main central compound of that family. So dotted throughout, the Thai countryside are some of these, what they call Ban Farang, right? This unusual or this new development in architecture that also reflects a new development in families, which is the inclusion of these European husbands and sons-in-law. So they are joining these Thai families, but with a few tweaks, right, to suit them better and their sensibilities better. So once they become a husband and son-in-law, these men need to reconcile their previous role as a male sex tourist with their new role as, again, a good man who's part of this family, right? Like, that's the goal. So, and as you read, that doesn't always work out, right? You read some examples of men who were not able to reconcile that and who were not understood as good husbands. But there's a need to do a sort of retrospective change to the narrative, right? The personal narrative and the personal subjectivity. And one of the big parts of what needs to be done there is to draw a line between the sex tourist identity or category and who they are now as husbands and sons-in-law. And likewise, to draw a line about their wives between the bar girl identity and their role as wives now in the countryside, right? So there's a sort of ongoing negotiation in terms of just how they're crafting their own personal stories, and certainly in terms of how they're presenting themselves and sort of who they are in this new context. So what the authors suggest then is that what we're seeing in this example is these men sort of articulating the emergent masculinities of sex tourist versus farang husband and son-in-law, and it's a kind of transient masculine subjectivity in terms of, for example, the individual man's sense of self and sense of social role has to change across that shift in position from the city to the countryside, right? So it's both reimagining what those identities are, and it's allowing that man to make something like a continuous narrative that makes sense both for him and for his now Thai relatives. Okay, so the final theme we're going to look at is commodified body parts. And there's two pieces you read that fall under this umbrella, the Locke and the Scheper-Hughes, both sort of important medical anthropologists. So now we're really looking at this idea of commodification from a pretty different perspective. So not looking at whole persons, but looking at parts of persons and really thinking about what is the relationship between a body part and the person it originally came from. What are the cultural or moral or political expectations about what that looks like, right? And a lot of this has to do with both changes in technology and other things that are pushing some of those boundaries, right? Locke is, as I said, a medical anthropologist. She's worked on a bunch of different things. Her most recent work that this is a part of is really about bioethics, again, in the context of some of these issues of things like transplants, or in this case, as she's talking about in this article, immortalized cell lines, right? So as you learned, individual cells from a person or tissues from a person are sort of turned into these immortal cell lines, which means that they sort of continue to exist pretty much forever. They're cultivated and used for all kinds of things, particularly research for new medical technologies or medical interventions. Right? It gets tricky and disconcerting when we understand how those cell lines are treated or what they are understood to be. Right? So those cell lines are patented typically by the bio companies, the biotech companies that are using them. So essentially we have this transformation of something that was human to something that is a commodity that is privately owned, right? Privately owned by someone other than the human from which the cells came. So what Locke says then is that the patenting of these human cells is a process of genetic information being transformed into private property through a patenting process. So when we start talking about patents, we start talking about these as products that belong to private companies, it definitely sounds like we're talking about a commodity, right? But we can't forget that these are quote-unquote commodities that were part of a particular person at some point, right? So the question then that she's asking, this is as much, again, a bioethical or philosophical question, is are human bodies inalienable possessions? This word inalienable refers to something that it's simply not possible, right, either culturally or morally, to give away, right? It's something that it can't be separated, right? So the question is, well, are body parts inalienable possessions? Or is it inviolable for body parts to remain with the person, or can they be disaggregated from that person and turned into essentially an object or a commodity? So the process by which these cell lines, which are being treated like commodities that are separate from the person, right, is that they need to take these cells and turn them into things, right? They need to be detached from the person. And that happens, right, to some extent, but it's, as Locke is pointing out, it's often incomplete and it's often contested, right? It's not an easy transition. You cannot, or it's difficult to completely strip human body parts from their associations with personhood, right? I mean, she gives that really interesting example of this where she's talking to a heart transplant surgeon, right? Somebody like steeped in the biomedical science, right? Who certainly is used these cell lines in research, or, you know, is part of institutions that do, and understands the heart as, you know, an organ, and understands the process by which that organ can be transplanted from one body to another. And yet this surgeon says that he would feel uncomfortable having a heart from someone whose behavior he thinks is reprehensible transplanted into his own body, right? So again, there's like a kind of assumption that the heart carries the identity or the perspective of the person that it came from, that it somehow is magically endowed with that person's personality. So again, this is just to point out that really removing body parts from all the associations with the person who it originally belonged to is very difficult, even in the context of these scientific settings. Now, that said, even though there's a certain amount of discomfort with this idea of commodifying body parts, there is actually a very long history in this country and elsewhere of commodifying dead bodies and body parts. And it's an ugly history. It's often the bodies of people with less social powers who are commodified or have been commodified in this way. So we can talk about, under that heading, everything from, you know, the public dissections that started to be put on in the 19th century, like this image on the top, where, as you read, you know, there was a time when, you know, dissections were done in an amphitheater so people could watch, to a more recent example that you may even be familiar with, which is the HeLa cell line, which is one of those immortalized cell lines that Locke is talking about that derive from a woman named Henrietta Lacks. The reason that I say you may be familiar with it is that there was a book that was published about this event or this situation by an author named Rebecca Skloot not that long ago, maybe it was 10 years ago, called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And she, in this book, which is a very interesting read, it's really accessible, it's not an academic book, so if you're interested in this issue, then I recommend it. It was also made into a film, so again, you may be already familiar with it, but what she looks at in this book is both the biomedical process by which these cells were cultivated over time and the biography of this woman and into, you know, her still living relatives. And one of the most shocking parts of it is, as a part of doing this book, when she contacted the living relatives of Henrietta Lacks, they had no idea that this HeLa cell line existed. And not surprisingly, they were shocked and dismayed to learn that a cell line derived from their mother and grandmother was in labs. Lacks was an African-American woman who tragically died very young of a very virulent form of cervical cancer. So one of the reasons that those cells were removed and have been used in a cell line is because this form of cancer is useful for researchers to study. So again, that's an interesting and troubling case that it's worth looking into further if you're interested in these issues. But in terms of Locke's article, She's suggesting that this is not new, this phenomenon, but it's one that certainly warrants ongoing attention, right? So the main case that she is focusing on in this article is this HGDP. It's a Human Genome Diversity Project. And it's, again, something that's ongoing that you can find more information about online. But basically, it's a project to investigate and track human genetic diversity across the globe. And what the organizers of the project basically did was encourage researchers to collect biological samples from people in various corners of the world in order to create these immortalized cell lines as a means for researchers to look at genetic diversity. So it can help researchers understand all kinds of things about human evolution, about human disease and possible treatments for it, etc., right? But there's all kinds of problems with it, right? Not the least of which, as Locke notes, that the people organizing the project didn't think to even, talk to or present this plan to the people from whom these samples were meant to be collected, right? So there was sort of no engagement with communities about whether or if this is a reasonable thing to do. The other key part of what's problematic about this project is that the idea of human groups as being genetically homogeneous is really problematic and is not the case for the most part, right? So there's this real sort of essentializing idea about human groups with language like isolates or even indigenous, right? And it's not to say that indigenous identity is not an absolutely sort of real thing in this world and an important thing that we need to honor and understand. But cultural identity and genetics are not the same, right? So it sort of reduces to biology, something that's a much more complex cultural and historical phenomenon. She knows just one example of that, which is the San people of southern Africa, who are used as one of these sort of, again, quote unquote, isolated populations for this study. Actually, their current way of living is not something they've lived in this way from time immemorial. That in fact, the isolation of the San people was a result of colonialism, right? Starting in the 19th century, right? So their history, including their sort of genetic profiles, is not one of a group of people who have lived alone in the desert for all time, but actually of a population that was part of a society that marginalized them. So again, understanding the implications for both this project and also just how we think about people and populations of people is really crucial, right? So indeed, when the project organizers did in fact reach out to the communities from which they wanted to collect biological samples, they got a lot of pushback, right? With indigenous people referring to it sometimes as the Vampire Project, right? Because they wanted to collect blood and cheek swabs, right, to get the genetic material. So what Locke's noticing here is the way that body parts, in this case cell lines, is being understood is really treating people as specimens, right? And often, particularly in this project, as sort of exotic specimens, right? So it's both othering those people as people and then reducing their body parts to commodities, right? That can be circulated in other spaces for things like research. So it's neo-colonial, clearly, right? It looks very much like colonial practice. And it falls under a category that the more positive name for it is bioprospecting, but it's often, from a critical stance, also understood as biopiracy, right? So it objectifies and really dehumanizes people, particularly people who are understood as quote-unquote other. So this is a kind of an extreme version of the commodification of bodies, but one that I think makes an interesting complement to some of the other things that you've read for this unit. So the final piece that you read is another sort of pair that goes really well with the Locke article, which is also about commodified body parts, also in a more maybe extreme or shocking way. And this is Nancy Shepherd Hughes, who's in the picture here, who is another sort of very well-known anthropologist, and who did something sort of radical, she's done a lot of different kinds of work as a medical anthropologist, but she created an organization called Organs Watch. This was in the late 1990s, early 2000s when she was doing this work. And it was an organization that included anthropologists, but others as well. And the goal, so it was really like an activist advocacy group. So they were doing ethnographic research on it, so to have the sort of information they needed. But it was really about making public the global traffic in organs, right, in body parts, which is a huge multi-billion dollar, basically illegal industry that has often sort of flown under the radar. And so Shepard Hughes wanted to do the research and sort of dig into it in various parts of the world to show what was going on, right? And hopefully to change it, right? Because it's repugnant when you learn what's going on, right? So what she talks about in this article that is based on the work of this organization, Organs Watch, is that there is a huge flow of organs for transplant from the south to the north, right? That basically there are two categories. There are organ givers and organ receivers. And it's a kind of apartheid, right? So the poor are organ givers and the rich are organ receivers, right? And the way that kind of, and often this is being done illegally, right? Or without any attention to medical ethics. And it's often built into medical tourism, right? Medical tourism is sort of a broader category of people, particularly people from the global north, going to countries where they can get cheaper medical care. And there are, in fact, sort of whole medical tourism industries built up where, people get packages where they can stay in a fancy hotel and sightsee and also get medical procedures done for much cheaper than they could in somewhere like the U.S. So some of these medical tourist organizations are doing that with organ transplants, right? Where you can, again, basically buy an organ and the transplant procedure, and you go to, again, a country typically in the global south to get this done. She notices that it's not only that whole scenario, which is, clearly deeply troubling, but there's increasingly even more demand put on this industry, which is wealthy organ receivers wanting to receive not the organs from recently deceased people, which is the practice often in the U.S. medical system. There are, of course, cases where for some organs a relative donates one, but a lot of it is coming from recently deceased people who agreed to be organ donors after their deaths. But then instead, some of these wealthy customers, medical tourists, want live organs, meaning they don't want it to come from a deceased person. They want it to come from a living person who donates it, right? And bioethicists, of course, like people like Locke, look at this, and it clearly raises all kinds of questions. But Shepard Hughes is really critical of the way that bioethics has responded to these industries. Falling back on questions of, for example, individual choice, and that the language of transplants often errs on the side of the altruism that it's understood to include, right? That somebody donating an organ is giving the gift of life. When in fact, as Shepard Hughes and her team shows, it's not, it doesn't really conform to that language at all, right? That people, quote unquote, donating or actually selling these organs are not doing so out of altruism, but are often doing so out of financial crisis and lack of opportunities for other sources of income, and because there are brokers aggressively encouraging them to do so, right? So it's a really ugly industry. She gives some specific examples, right? Like that in Brazil, people will sell a kidney from a healthy person for as little as $1,000. That in India, what she found was when she interviewed the people who had sold a kidney, that it was something that typically happened during a financial crisis, right? And it didn't solve that crisis because the amount of compensation was so low. In Argentina, they tracked that organs were being taken from mentally ill people in asylums, right? So clearly not ethically sound, and deeply exploitative. So she's really trying to take on this very ugly industry, which also, again, raises all kinds of questions for our broader, this broader lecture about when and how pieces of people or people can be commodified, right? And when that is understood as acceptable or not. So both the sort of political and cultural ways that we try to determine whether something is acceptable. So indeed, in the context of the global traffic in organs, as Scheper-Hughes shows, donors are treated not as people, but as suppliers of products, of medical material, right, in the form of an organ. The donors are not often part of the story, right? So the recipients of the transplant are, but the donors often in these contexts remain unknown. So not only are they not known as individuals, it's not known what the context of the donation was, but there's also no recognition of the ongoing challenges that emerge after that donation or the selling of that organ, right? It's not a discrete, no-risk procedure. That people who give organs in particularly poor parts of the world often have ongoing physical problems, right? Unless you have really good care after you donate an organ, it's very difficult for your body to recover, as well as, of course, social and psychological damage. Scheper-Hughes in this context is really acting as an activist and trying to shut down this global trade in organs. But in so doing, I think she also gives us food for thought for thinking about the commodification of people and body parts in the contemporary world. Okay, we're going to stop there, and I hope you have a great rest of the week. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.